Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 14. In this chapter, we're going to continue our discussion of the Cal Perfect. However, in this chapter, we're going to cover the weak verb system. In the last chapter, we emphasized the strong verb, and that's the paradigm verb that you memorized, katal, katala, katalta, etc. Before you engage the material in this chapter, be certain that you've memorized the Cal Perfect strong verb paradigm. All of the things that you're about to see in this chapter derive and compare to that strong verb paradigm. If you've memorized the Cal Perfect strong verb paradigm, there will be no new paradigms to memorize in this chapter. In fact, let me comment a little bit on my methodology. There are two ways to approach a language when you're learning the verb system. The first approach is the more traditional approach, which comprises memorizing long lists of paradigms and many paradigms. You learn by learning one strong verb paradigm and maybe 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 weak verb paradigms. So by the end of a system, you have to keep 10 or 12 or 13 or more basic paradigms in your head in order to accurately read, translate, and parse verbs. In Basics of Biblical Hebrew, we try to minimize paradigm memorization. And so once you know the strong verb paradigm from chapter 13, I'm simply going to teach you what happens to weak verbs, and I'm going to show you the morphological changes so that you understand the language and you understand the changes. If you'll track with me, work to understand the changes in light of what you know about weak root letters, you'll be able to identify verbs without having to memorize paradigms. We want to minimize paradigm memorization when we encounter the verb system so that we can read better with more accuracy and fluidity. Let's begin then by starting with the guttural weak verbs. Look at your screen with me. We're going to begin by looking at one guttural and two guttural verbs. Now, in certain forms of one guttural and two guttural verbs, you will see the hatef pathik appearing under the guttural consonant instead of the vocal schwa. This spelling change is caused by the fact that the gutturals cannot take vocal schwa. Now, this is something you learned back in the very first 3 chapters of the grammar. Gutturals in Hebrew do not like vocal schwa. They usually will take, therefore, the hatef vowels, normally hatef pathik. So look again on your screen with me. In the examples you see on your screen, one guttural and two guttural, you will see 2 sets of verbs, each with a guttural. In the first category, the guttural's in the first root position, and in the second category, the guttural's in the second root position. Let's look at the first category, the one guttural verbs. In the 2 MP and the 2 FP forms, with the guttural in first root position, you'll observe that there's a hatef pathik in the location where you would normally expect a vocal schwa in the strong verb. The appearance of the hatef pathik is due to the fact that the guttural cannot take the vocal schwa and therefore takes the hatef pathik. So you don't need to memorize an entirely new paradigm. You already know the morphology behind the change. If it's a guttural, you're going to have the hatef pathik, not the vocal schwa. Let's look at the two guttural category. In the two guttural category, the guttural's in the second root position. And I'm showing you the 3FS and the 3CP forms. In the 3FS and the 3CP, you normally would expect a vocal schwa under the second root letter. But here in red, we've identified that the second root letter is hatef pathik in each case. The reason that you have hatef pathik is because the guttural can't take the normal vocal schwa. And like in the one guttural category, where you get that guttural and a vocal schwa is going to shift or change to hatef pathik. Since you already know that gutturals cannot take the vocal schwa and take the hatef pathik, there's no need to memorize a new paradigm. You simply apply what you already know to what you see on the page. So let's look at your screen again, but this time we're going to look at the paradigms together. The one guttural, the two guttural, and we've even included the third chet ayin here to show you that there's almost no change in the paradigms. In fact, we've highlighted the changes in red, and you'll see very little red on the page. What you'll see is that in a few places, the vocal schwa that you would normally expect in the paradigm forms has shifted to hatef pathik. This change should not cause you any difficulty in properly parsing or identifying the verbs, and therefore there's no need to memorize these paradigms. Let's look at another category of weak verb together, the third aleph verbs. Here we have a guttural in the third root position, and the guttural is the specific guttural aleph. Look at your screen with me. You will notice that in the paradigm of the third aleph verbs, 2 major changes occur. First, Notice that the stem vowel has changed from the short A class vowel, pathic in the strong verb, to the long A vowel, comets. Once again, the pathic stem vowel in the strong verb paradigm has changed to a comet stem vowel in the third olive paradigm. We've highlighted that change in the third olive category in red. Now, why does the pathic change to a comet in the third olive category? For this reason. The olive quiesces, that is, it becomes silent. And you know early on from our studies that the olive will quiesce or become silent. When the olive becomes quiescent or silent, the vowel pathic lengthens to comets to compensate for that change. Therefore, you don't have the pathic, but you have the comets because it's compensated for the silent olive. The second change, look at your screen with me. The second change you'll notice is that in those suffirmatives where you would normally expect to see a doggish lane in the tau, for example, the 2ms, the 2fs, the 1cs, 2mp, and the 2fp, you will notice that the doggish lane has dropped out in the suffirmatives of each of those forms. This is because the doggish lane will only occur in a begad-kafat letter when the preceding letter is a consonant. Now this aleph, this quiescent aleph, functions not as a consonant but represents a vowel sound. Therefore, the doggish lane drops out. The fact that the doggish lane drops out shouldn't present to you any difficulty in identifying these suffirmatives. Two changes only in the three olive category. The stem vowel has shifted from pathic to comets, and the doggish lane has dropped out of the tau. If you just simply understand that this is caused by the fact that the aleph is quiescent, you'll be able to identify these verbs without any difficulty. Now, the fact of the matter is, we're going to see third olive verbs doing this all of the time in many different stems and in many different conjugations. So if you work to understand the phenomenon now, you'll save having to memorize not only this paradigm, but perhaps dozens of other paradigms later. So there is a lot of power in learning the morphology or the reason for the changes, rather than memorizing different paradigms. Let's look at another category together. On your screen, you will now see the third hay verbs. We've moved from third olive to third hay. Now, the third hay verbs exhibit some of the more profound changes that you'll encounter in the weak verb system. Look at the paradigm with me in your third hay category on the left of your screen. You'll notice that in most of the forms, in fact, every form except one, the hay of the verbal root has dropped out. The hay is present in the 3ms, bana, but in every other form from the 3fs to the 1cp, the hay has fallen out. Now, let's look at a few of these forms. Look at the 2ms, 2fs, 1cs, 2mp, 2fp, and 1cp forms. You'll notice that the hay has dropped out, but it's been replaced by a heroic yod stem vowel. It's been replaced by a heroic yod stem vowel. Now, why? Here's the reason, and this is a bit of a trick, but it's important to know. Third A verbs in Hebrew were originally third yo verbs. Let me say that again. Third hay verbs in Hebrew were originally third yod verbs. Let me demonstrate on my screen what I mean by that. We're now talking about weak verbs that have the weak root letter hay in the third root position. Originally in Hebrew, the verb was not a third hay verb, it was actually a third yod verb. Pronounced not bana, but banai. At a particular time in the language, the yod dropped off and it was replaced by hay. Now, why does that matter? It matters for this reason. In the forms that I just mentioned on the screen, 2ms, 2fs, 1cs, etc., the heroic yod stem vowel that you see in those forms is diagnostic of the fact that these verbs used to be third yod, meaning this: when you inflect the verb, the original yod reappears, in this case as a heroic yod. The importance of understanding that third hay verbs were originally third yod stems from the fact that when those verbs are inflected, the hay root letter in the third position drops off. So how do you look it up? How do you know what the definition is if a root letter is gone? You'll see the bait and the noon in the first and second position, but you won't see the weak guttural hay at the end when it falls off. If you can think of the yod and the hay as interchangeable, or the yod being diagnostic of the hay that's fallen off, you'll be able to accurately identify this weak verb as third hay You'll be able to look it up in the lexicon. You'll be able to identify its definition and properly translate it without having to memorize the paradigm. In addition to the loss of the hay in these third hay forms where the yod reappears, you're going to see another change as well. When the hay drops off and the heric yod appears, being diagnostic and unique to this particular class, the dogish lene in the tau of the perfect sufformative will also drop off. Now you saw the same phenomenon in the third aleph category. Again, in this category, as you'll see on your screen, when the heric yod stem vowel replaces the comet's hay, the sufformative ending in tau is immediately following that heric yod. Because the begad kafat letter in that sufformative is preceded by a vowel, the dogish lene drops off. So the reason for the loss of the dogish lene is because it's preceded by the vowel, and begad kafats won't take the lene. So you've seen that change before in the previous paradigm. You're seeing it again here. However, the basic structure of the sufformative still exists. The basic structure of the sufformative still exists, and you shouldn't have any trouble identifying these forms. When it comes to third hay verbs, the important thing to remember is this. Third hay verbs used to be third yod, and that yod reappears in many of the forms as a stem vowel connecting the verb to its perfect sufformative. I want to talk about one other form in this paradigm as well. Let's look together at your screen at the 3FS form. The 3FS form. We'll pronounce it together first. Ba, natha. 3 syllables, ba, natha. Here you will see on your screen that the hay didn't drop out in the 3FS form. Rather, it's strengthened to a tau. Again, let me say that. Here you will see on your screen that the hay of the verb did not drop out. Rather, it's strengthened to a tau. Now, you've seen hay strengthened to tau with nouns. With nouns that end in hay and you add a pronominal suffix to them, and with nouns that end in hay in the construct state. The same thing occurs here. In order to add the 3FS perfect sufformative comet's hay to the third hay verb bana, the hay of the verbal root must first be strengthened. So there's no heric yod here to diagnose this particular verb as third hay. Rather, what happens is the hay, the weak female consonant, changes to tau, the strong female or feminine consonant, and then it takes the perfect sufformative. So you'll want to be careful in identifying this form. It's not beit nun tau as its root letters. It's beit nun hay. The hay has been strengthened to tau in order to take the 3FS perfect sufformative. Very good. Once you become comfortable with the hay dropping off and becoming a heric yod, or the hay strengthening to a tau in the 3FS form, the identification of the third hay weak verbs in the perfect stem should be relatively easy. You don't want to memorize this paradigm. Rather, you want to memorize the types of changes, and these changes occur because the hay in the third root position is weak. In most instances, you'll see that the hay has changed to heric yod. In the 3FS, the hay has changed to a tau. One more form before we conclude. In the 3CP form, of bana, you will observe that you have neither the hay, the heric yod, or a strengthened tau. You simply have the first 2 root letters and the perfect sufformative shurik. In this case, you'll just have to memorize the fact that the 3CP form completely loses the hay root letter, and it has nothing to replace it. It has nothing to replace it. But that's only one form in the paradigm. Let's move to our next weak verb category. Geminate verbs. Geminate verbs, like geminate nouns, have identical second and third root letters. Geminate verbs, like geminate nouns, are slightly irregular when you inflect them. Look with me at your screen. You'll see 3 different geminate verb paradigms compared to the strong verb paradigm. There's geminate strong, there's geminate weak 1, and geminate weak 2. We're going to focus today only on geminate strong and geminate weak 1. First, notice that in the 3MS, the 3FS, and the 3CP, the geminate verb is spelled just like the regular cal-perfect strong verb. In the second and first person forms, however, there are significant spelling changes. In the second and first person, there are significant spelling changes. You will see on your screen, highlighted in red, a holum wow occurring between the geminate consonant and the perfect sufformative. You can think of this as a connecting vowel unique to the geminate verb weak verb class. In addition to the whole and while connecting vowel, you will also see a doggish forte in the geminate consonant. Look at your screen with me again. The doggish forte in the bait in the geminate strong category appears in all second and first person forms. That doggish forte is diagnostic of the fact that this is a geminate verb, and you see the geminate reappearing, the geminate consonant reappearing as a doggish forte in these forms. You'll observe then in the geminate weak verb 1 class that there is no doggish forte in that geminate consonant, and you already know why. You can't put a doggish forte in a guttural consonant, and the geminate consonant in the weak 1 class is resh. The resh consonant is a guttural consonant, and you can't put a doggish forte in it. Therefore, it rejects the doggish forte, and there will be a comet under the first root letter in every case. It still maintains the unique connecting vowel, whole and while, between the verbal root and the perfect sufformative, but it does not exhibit the doggish forte that is helpful in identifying the geminate weak verb class. Let's look at your screen together, and let me highlight these important changes that occur in the spelling of geminate verbs. First, you'll see at the top of your screen the verb savav, somic bait bait. It's geminate because the second and third root letters are identical in its lexical form. This form is inflected in the Cal perfect 2ms. Cal perfect 2ms. We know it's perfect because we see the perfect 2ms sufformative at the end of the verb. But now let's look at some of the changes. We'll start at the beginning of the verb. First, you'll observe there's a doggish forte in the bait. This doggish forte represents the original geminate consonant. It's been lost, but it reappears as the doggish forte in the geminate consonant. Secondly, you'll see a whole and while connecting vowel that is placed between the verbal root and the perfect sufformative. This connecting vowel aids in pronunciation, but it also aids in identifying the geminate weak verb class. Other weak verbs do not add this whole and while connecting vowel. And so if you can see this whole and while connecting vowel and identify it as belonging to the geminate weak verb class, you can properly reconstruct the verbal root. Finally, you'll notice, like the third aleph and the third hey categories, when you have a connecting vowel like this, you will lose the doggish lene in the perfect sufformative because the tau is immediately preceded by a vowel sound. Once again, the assimilated geminate consonant reappearing as a doggish forte and the whole and while connecting vowel will accurately identify these forms as belonging to the weak verb geminate class in every instance. Therefore, there's no need to memorize the paradigm. It's a completely different paradigm to memorize. If you've memorized the strong verb paradigm and the weak verb morphology of the geminate weak verb class, the fact that there's a doggish forte in the geminate consonant and the whole and while connecting vowel, you'll be able in every instance to reconstruct the verbal root. That is from somic bait bait. Therefore, you'll know the definition. And if you don't know the definition, then you can look it up in the lexicon because you know all three root letters. Now let's move to our next weak verb class, the biconsonantal weak verbs. Look at your screen with me. Biconsonantal verbs are composed of two consonants rather than three. These verbs are also called hollow or two yod wow verbs. Now I'll explain in a moment why they're called hollow or two yod wow verbs, but look at your screen and you'll see that the perfect 3ms form that appears at the bottom have two root letters, not three. Calm, he rose. Som, he set. Ba, he entered. Those three examples have two root letters and not three. Well, biconsonantal verbs are subclassified or subcategorized by the vowel letter that exists between the two root letters. Look at your screen again with me. The lexical or dictionary form of a biconsonantal verb is not the Cal perfect 3ms form as it is with most other verbs. These verbs are listed in the lexicon under their infinitive construct forms with the vowel letter of their respective classes, shurik, hirik yod, or whole and wow. Now, you don't know what the infinitive construct looks like at this point. Neither do you know how it functions. It doesn't matter. What you need to know is that when biconsonantal verbs appear in the lexicon or in your vocabulary list, they appear with a distinctive medial vowel letter. Look again at your screen with me. you'll see in the left column the Cal-Perfect 3MS form of the verbs come, sam, and ba. But in the right column, you'll see the actual lexical form, which is not Cal-Perfect 3MS. Rather, it's the infinitive construct form, cum, seem, and bo. The first example has a Shurik medial vowel letter, a U-class vowel. The second example, seem, has a Hirik Yod medial vowel letter, an I-class stem vowel, an I-class vowel. And the third example, bo, has the Holam Wow medial vowel letter, an O-class vowel. So you can think of these biconsonantal verbs as belonging to a Shurik class or U class, a Hirik Yod class or I class, and a Holam Wow class or O class. In the Cal-Perfect, however, that distinctive medial vowel letter is lost in every form. Look at your screen again, and you'll see the inflections of cum, seem, and bo in the Cal-Perfect. What you'll notice in each instance is that there are only two root letters followed by the perfect sufformative. Let's read through the paradigm cum from the 3MS to the 1CP together. Com, kama, comta, compt, comti, camu, comtem, comten, comnu. In every instance, you'll see that there are only two root letters in the paradigm form, not three. But you'll also observe that all of the strong verb sufformatives, or all of the perfect verb sufformatives, are maintained without any change. Therefore, the end of the verb, the perfect sufformative, will accurately identify for you the person, gender, and number of each verb. The fact that there are only two root letters will be diagnostic of the fact that these verbs are biconsonantal. Now, in your vocabulary, you must memorize the appropriate medial vowel letter associated with each biconsonantal verb so that you can memorize the lexical form and know what vowel class that particular biconsonantal verb belongs to. The reason for that is this. In the Cal-Perfect, the medial vowel letter is gone. But in most of the other conjugations of the Hebrew verb system, the imperfect, the imperative, the infinitive construct, and the infinitive absolute, you'll see this medial vowel letter cropping back up and being an important feature of the spelling. So you need to know both the lexical form with the medial vowel letter and the fact that that medial vowel letter drops out in the perfect conjugation. Once you know that, the identification of the perfect verbs in the biconsonantal weak verb class shouldn't provide you with too much difficulty. The biconsonantal verbs are the last weak verbs that we'll discuss in this chapter. But before we move on, I want to talk about one more important feature that deals with a particular group of verbs in the weak verb categories. Look at your screen with me. You may have already observed this fact, but it's very important to point out. Three particular weak verb categories exhibit only two root consonants in certain inflected forms. These are the third he, geminate, and biconsonantal weak verb categories. Now what this means is this. In some of these forms, when you encounter them in the text, you will see that they have only two root letters and not three. When you see an inflected form with only two weak root letters, you're going to have to reconstruct that verb in order to get all three root letters or to restore a medial vowel letter in order to properly identify the lexical form and therefore the appropriate definition. To do that, you don't need to memorize these three paradigms. You simply need to be able to highlight or to recall those features of the morphology that I've already highlighted for you that distinguish these particular weak verb classes. That means when you see them in context, you'll know, oh, this is a third he verb, or this is a geminate verb, or this verb is biconsonantal. Let's look together and observe each of the distinguishing features in each weak verb class. Look at your screen with me. Weak verbs with only two root consonants in certain inflected forms can be identified or distinguished one from another by, number one, let's look at third he verbs. All second and first person forms have a Hirik Yod stem vowel. Remember that third he verbs were originally third Yod, and this Hirik Yod is diagnostic for this weak verb class in the perfect. Identification of the 3MS and 3FS forms should present little difficulty because you understand that the he in the 3MS form is the third he, and the tau in the 3FS form is the strengthened he. Only the 3CP form will be a challenge because there's no strengthened he and no heroic yod. Next, look at number 2. With geminate verbs, all second and first person forms have a holum wow connecting vowel. The doggish forte in the second root consonant also distinguishes this weak verb class. The third person forms retain all 3 root letters and they're not weak. So it's only the first and second person forms that will require special attention. The doggish forte in the second root letter and the holum wow connecting vowel will distinguish the geminate verb from third he verbs and from biconsonantal verbs. Finally, look at number 3 with me. With biconsonantal verbs, there is no distinguishing stem vowel or connecting vowel. However, the pathic under the first root consonant in all second and first person forms will help in the identification of this weak verb class. But think of it this way. If it's got a doggish forte in the second root letter and a holum wow connecting vowel, it's geminate. If it's got a heroic yod stem vowel or a strengthened tau, it's third he. If it doesn't have one of those features, your default will be biconsonantal. Once you understand those features that distinguish these particular weak verb classes, and once you're able to associate them with the appropriate weak verb class, paradigm memorization is not needed. And if you can avoid memorizing paradigms, you can proceed more quickly in the language, identify forms without an abundance of memorizing, and you'll have better facility in the language for long term. Additionally, these phenomena, that is, the assimilation of a geminate consonant, the holum wow connecting vowel, etc., you will see those types of things occurring in other verb classes, in the imperfect, in the imperative, in the nifal. When you understand this feature here in the cal stem, your base stem, you're not only learning the cal stem, but you're also learning important information about weak verb morphology in general that will apply all over the verb system. So it may be a bit awkward now. You may be thinking, why should I memorize these weird features? Because if you know about the verbs, you know much more than you think at this point. You know about not just the cal verbs, but you know about nifal and pl and perfect verbs, imperfect verbs, imperatives and participles. Your knowledge of the language is expanding. What we want to do is we want to continue to take what you know, to build what you know, and then to keep applying it to more and more and more context in the verb system. And by doing that, paradigm memorization is kept at a minimum, and your understanding of the language is kept to a maximum. All right, we're done with our lecture for chapter 14, but before we go, let me emphasize this. Weak verbs and weak verb morphology is super important. Why? Because strong verbs in the Hebrew Bible probably occur less than 10% of the time. Weak verbs occur at a rate of 90% and more. The only reason really we learn the strong verb is so that we have a baseline to diagnose the weak verbs. To have any success in the language, you must master weak verb morphology. That's why we took so much time in this chapter to explain in detail all of the changes. If you fail to understand weak verb morphology, you'll fail to have a grasp of the verb system. Now, there's not that much in terms of what's actually going on, and most of the changes you already know. There's only a few new things in this chapter, and if you master them, you're guaranteed success later on.